Welcome to our podcast, Brain Trash. This is where we get to talk about all of the things that no one else is talking about in psychiatry. Things like neurodivergence, things like sex, things like the kink community. So today we're going to be looking at all of these topics for episode 2 of season 2 of Brain Trash. My name is Maria.
And I'm Tabitha.
And we're psychiatric nurse practitioners who are not afraid to talk about all of the dirty details of all the topics you want to know about. So let's dive in. All right, so today we get to talk a little bit about a topic which is looking at like why autistic folks are more likely to be in kink communities. And this is a conversation that we started having when we were in our company retreat in Seattle, and we were kind of looking around and seeing like furries, and we were seeing like the pups and the masks and the leather and like all of the things. And like with the knowledge that like there are more people who are in the LGBT community who are autistic, we were kind of like, what's the correlation? And like, what does this look like, right? So do you have a lot of patients who are like openly in kink communities that you see?
I would say, just based on the population that I see, I have a lot of humans that disclose things like that to me, or just, people in the queer community. I would say like most of my patient population is that. So I hear about stuff like this a lot, and it really is just kind of like an everyday experience for me.
So what are like some of the most common ones that you hear about?
I think that people are less likely to talk about specifics of kink communities, like being in the furry community, stuff like that. But a lot of times it'll be coded in like, I'm trying to think of like different ways people say it that isn't like, I mean, a lot of people who play Dungeons and Dragons.
I mean, to be fair, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I have specific examples that would not be.
Wait, like a sexy Dungeons and Dragons?
I mean, we'll start talking about gender roles or things like that, and then we'll, talk about board games and Dungeons and Dragons and stuff like that, and it turns into conversations about stuff like this, so.
Yeah, I mean, like I've had a lot of autistic patients who are, and I guess like a lot of friends who are like in poly communities, right? People who are just like kind of open to exploring, like I'll have sex with whoever, and like, my relationship has like a more of like an open stance and things like that. But I guess it's kind of like nuanced and it's kind of in there. But
I always like ask people, sorry.
No, go ahead. You always ask people what?
I always ask people like at the end of my eval, I'm always like, is there anything that we haven't talked about that has to do with like lifestyle, sexuality, culture, spirituality, that kind of shit that is really important to you that I know about you so that I can better care for you? And a lot of times people will disclose things like that there. So
interesting. We did dive into some of the research on this before this episode. So like we looked a little bit about like what are the studies that exist on this, and like what are the communities, what are the experiences of folks, and we looked a little bit at some of the subreddits that are relevant, because that's always important too, right? Yeah. So BDSM was a big one. That was probably like the most spoken about and the most researched out of everything. So what did we find out about like why do people like this vibe? What's going on with BDSM?
Well, I think a lot of times this has a lot of structured roles, routines, rituals. Like there's a lot of very explicit consent, right? Safe words, like all this stuff where people have kind of a map for what is and is not okay, what is and is not expected of them. You can choose whatever role is more comfortable for you. You can have lots of different roles. And so there's a script essentially, right? Like I think for autistic people, like that is, you tell me what I need to do, what I need to say, all of that is like in any social setting, I'm gonna feel a lot more confident about that,
Yeah. And like, it's kind of one of those things where you get to talk about the things in advance and you consent in advance. And you have like, we were talking about this kind of like almost a menu, right? Where you have like the menu items of like, these are my yes, these are my no. Let's like go for this today. I'm going to consent to these things. This is exactly how it's going to be. Like it almost plays it out for you of like, here are the things that are going to happen. And yes, I agree to all of these things, which keeps you safe, right? It makes you feel like it's predictable, it's structured. And like a lot of the times it's not verbal, right? So like a lot of these things are more sensory based. So things like ropes or leather or like, I don't know, other types of like textures or things that are a part of like I don't know, like pressure and things like that, depending on like what avenue you're going into, are appealing. And then you add in like the kind of like there aren't as many verbal spontaneous things that you have to say. It might be the fact that you have like duct tape on your mouth, right? Or like you're blindfolded, or there's just like less of like my face is supposed to look a certain way and I need to perform a certain way. That being perceived almost disappears.
Yeah, well, and I think that when you're in that space, right, like somebody who doesn't know about these things or who only knows like stigmatized versions of the shit, like they look at that and they think, oh, that sounds really dangerous and risky and, it's super strange or whatever. But when you look at actual research, especially like qualitative research that has quotes from people and truly like digs into what is it about this that is so that draws people in, is more about that it does give them a sense of safety, right? So even though to outside observers who don't understand or haven't educated themselves about it, it feels like it looks dangerous, it feels safer for them because of these things. And so there's like a lot of safe experimentation that can happen, where somebody who's neurotypical might just be able to say like, hey, I want to try this new thing, and they like put on an outfit and do it, right? That's not necessarily something that a neurodivergent person is going to be able to do, to be able to navigate and have the confidence to do in a space that isn't already outlined for them in a way that they don't have to like initiate that.
I think like sexy cosplay and like dressing up as characters on that note is like a little bit more structured because you are being a certain person versus like I'm going to be the maid, or I'm going to be like whatever the Halloween costume was that you're grabbing off of the shelf at Spencer's back in like the 2000s, right? Like those are a little bit too vague and not defined enough. So like a lot of these spaces in BDSM are already defined. Like you know that you are going to be like the person that is in charge, or you're not in charge, or like maybe there's a switch that's going to happen, right? So I think like, yeah, and things are just more defined, and that makes it a lot easier for people who are neurodivergent and a lot more accessible. And also like these are spaces that are very open and accepting. You can like enter the avenue online, less pressure, as we talked about in our last episode, where like I can explore this online and there's a lot of information, and like it can become a special interest in a weird way, and people are accepting. It's not like it's for like, the super popular people who are over there and like they're too good for me. Like they're just like, come on in, let's get your ropes on kind of vibe.
There is, though, also in some of the research, it talks about how autistic people want to be more engaged in the communities, but there is some like gatekeeping stuff that people will recognize or sense, right? Like if there is like an intimidating aspect to joining like an in-person group, or to
Yes.
initiating even that, when it's not necessarily like a sexual impetus that makes them want to be a part of that community, it still is something that's really hard to approach. And so looking for communities that are like neurodivergent affirming and not just like inclusive in terms of like, hey, everybody can have
Right.
a mask and some leather, right? So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think it like, again, like going back to the nonverbal piece, it's just a lot less pressure. And like even when you get into it, it's like you could kind of like enter in and like be silent and just like take commands if that's what you want. Research says that people who are autistic and practice BDSM are more likely to be interested in things like bondage, restraint, more so than like the verbal or psychological scenes that can occur. That's a little bit more accessible and less pressure, and I think that allows to have more pleasure in it because of that. And then there's also higher rates of like men who are autistic having like more interest in like the sadistic or the masochist type of kinks or fantasies, more so than neurotypical people.
Well, and I think too, there's a big part of that that can translate to other aspects of life as well. Like when I think about being a theater kid, right? Like, pretty much everybody in the theater space is neurodivergent of some sort, right? And things I would hear from my friends and things that I felt myself as well was just kind of like, if I'm playing a character, I'll sing and dance in front of thousands of people and it doesn't feel weird at all. But if I have to be me, like in a setting like this where I'm like, I am a human being and this is who I am, it feels weirder. So having a role that you can step into that's maybe that like total opposite of you, of like the masochist horror bondage or whatever, right? Like having a role that doesn't feel like you might actually make it a lot easier to feel safer and experience more pleasure out of it.
Yeah, and I think that's where people kind of get into like the pup play. And this is something that I was not aware was a like a specific kink until we had a tent for Paper Flower at Pride, and John, who was our NP, and he was like with me, really like he's gay, so he's like more, I guess, like knowing of like the different kind of like kink communities, and I think he's just more involved than I was, and just naive me. So I was like, oh my God, these people are wearing these leather masks. What is that? So he was explaining like pups to me. So then we went over to like the bondage area. Well, somebody covered our tent, and like there's people who are like playing with balls, and like they were like wrestling, and then there were people who had like them on leashes, and it was just really fascinating because I've never seen anything like it, right? We don't see it in like the day to day. So that was something that we saw this year at Pride, and I was kind of explaining to a lot of our team that also hadn't been exposed to it. But this is a specific kink that allows people to go into a role that of a puppy, right? That you're not necessarily going to have to be verbal. It's not like pressure to be yourself. You don't have masking. There's like consent involved. There's boundaries. It's like very low pressure. You have a mask on, so you don't have to worry about like people seeing your face. And like it's also like supposed to like dim some of the sensory input, which could also be beneficial, I guess, for people who are like hypersensitive and autistic. So it could be another kind of thing that draws people in. But I just thought that was really fascinating. But I guess it's a very inclusive community overall.
Well, yeah, and I think when we look through research for it, it's like I like the study that was like just specifically asking people in like the pup play community, not necessarily autistic people, but they did all this research, and part of that was looking at people's scores on the AQ, so the autism questionnaire, right? Like, and seeing how many of them reached that threshold for the cutoff for like, hey, you have a lot of autistic traits, right? So it wasn't like geared towards autism, so there's not as much like sampling bias, but basically like what was it, 55.7% of people scored above the cutoff, and then which is like 60, I think, and then 35.4 scored even above 70, which is like in a much higher range. So this gives that specific example of why this is much more represented by autistic people in communities like this, because of how much those things actually provide a lot of community and safety for something that other people may just be able to experience in a regular sense without any of the extra stuff.
Was that study looking at like pup play or just kink in general? Like what was that study looking
No,
at
it
for
was
that?
pup play. It was like an international study about it, and like I'm trying to remember what the other things were, like preference for roles, right? So like if they were doing more solo stuff, or the with both of them, or more than, they make like packs, right? So the whole community or group can be like a pack, and it doesn't have to be something sexual, but just kind of like how this all led into that like identity formation and all of that.
Interesting. I don't know if it was the same study, but there was the one who had like the qualitative experiences of people within that community. And like there was somebody who mentioned that like being in a role where someone sets the rules for me helps me function at my best, was a quote, right? Or like it talked a little bit about how like autistic people who are in like the pup position, like being given like the clear rules and being kind of like told what to do a little bit more, and like the scent of the leather and just kind of all of the sensory things that go around that really like were enjoyable. And yeah, but it's interesting to see how like people get really like engaged in those communities, and it's like more of a sense of belonging. It like really kind of like goes beyond just the sexual part, right?
Well, I think too, I just was thinking of this, but if you are like a provider or a mental health professional who works with anybody that's autistic, or anybody that you suspect might be autistic, or you just want to learn more about this, I don't know if you've ever read it, but Unmasking Autism by Devin Price. I
Love that
like
book.
the whole last chapter of that book is about very similar things. And so once I had looked at all of this, and also then thinking back to when I read the book, is like, well, let's be real, I listened to the audiobook because I don't like to read. But anyway, um, and I actually really like the audiobook better because it's Devin that's reading the book, right? So like you get to hear their voice and stuff. But yeah, I don't know. It coincides with a lot of what we're talking about too. So that's another really good way to get more information if you're looking for education for yourself or for clients or whatever.
Or if you're just kind of like in the community and you need a really good book to read because you're autistic and you've been late diagnosed, Unmasking Autism would be your book.
Just get ready to like cry on page 1, basically.
And be like, oh my God, why does this have to like hit so hard everywhere?
Really rude.
Yeah. But also like one of the better books ever written, and we don't have enough books like that at all, which means we should probably write one.
Yeah.
Could be
I think the
eventually.
other thing too that kind of pairs in with this as well is when we look at just the overrepresentation of autistic people in the LGBTQ community, right? So like I know that we've touched on that, but when we look at that specifically as well, I think a lot of this gets roped together into these really stigmatized communities because for a neurotypical person, it's really easy to say like that's weird or that's not natural, right? And these are people who maybe this is the most real form of themselves that they've ever felt comfortable with, and they're being told, you know, this is super strange that you're like this and all that stuff. Most of us who are artistic are used to some level of bullying at some point in our lives, right? But when you are constantly invalidated, having communities to go to and say like this is a safe space for me is really, really important. And so having things like Pride where people can gather, but then also feel like there are also neurodivergent subsets within that, and that safety can be a really great thing for people's mental health.
Yeah, for sure, dude. And like, I think even when we look at like gender in terms of autism and how a lot of people don't feel necessarily like attached to gender roles or to a certain gender and just, you know, become like non-binary, right? Like a lot of these kinks don't require a gender role. And I think that could just make it a lot better in general for people to explore and more interesting for people to explore because like you don't have like this like, well, in porn, I see X, Y, and Z, and like this is the role of the woman and this is the role of the man. It kind of just takes that out. So I think that's also helpful too, just to kind of like be more exploratory with like your gender and yourself and like who am I and like what do I enjoy instead of just like this is what I'm supposed to be. And we also had mentioned furries. I do want to clarify that apparently, because I don't know much about it, all I know is that I'm very terrified of people in suits. Like, right? But like I did a lot of research, I read the studies. About 15% of people who are furries are self-reported to be autistic. There's about another 13% who say they don't know they could be. And there's only a small subset, so about like 25% of this community is like more of like a sexual thing. It's more often not than not like not a sexual thing. But I think like a lot of people just kind of like assume that people are just in suits having sex. Not necessarily the thing, right? Like sometimes it's like just the intimacy of like being able to like wear a suit and you go to Pride and you're in your suit and people are like, oh my God, I know that character. Or like, oh my God, that's so cute. Like, let me take a picture. Let me give you a hug. And you have like social anxiety. And if it were just you, you're perceived, but now you're able to like give someone a hug and you're like a character and that's so sweet. I'm still terrified.
I also think it's like really fucked up that Pride is typically during summer months because in Arizona,
Yes.
I feel like you might die if you wear a full costume, you know? But
Well, I mean, like they do move it to October, which isn't much better because it's still hot as balls every October I've ever been to Pride in Arizona.
well, when I say summer, I mean it's like the
It's summer.
11 months out of the
It's summer.
summer in Phoenix, you know?
Yeah. Somebody should petition for that to be made in like February. So then
Yeah,
people can like,
January,
wear their leather
February.
in their suits and not be sweating to death. Cause like I don't know, but maybe it's like a sensory thing for some people. Like it does kind of like take out a lot of that sound. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know if it amplifies sound. I've never worn one.
Yeah, I don't know either. But I think looking at the amount of community that we saw specifically like recently at Pride, right? Because that's just the most recent interaction I have with it is like a lot of what I was thinking about as we were having these conversations is like, I don't know. There's so many things that are like this where like, did everyone do this everywhere? Where there was like these rumors that went around, but like all the teenagers in the United States thought the same thing. Like it's illegal to have your light on in the car or whatever. For me, it was like anytime somebody talked about furries, it was always that weird. There's weird sexual shit, right? And it's like it's not always. It's actually
Mostly not, right?
mostly
Yeah.
not sexual, right? And sure, there may be that like subset or some experiences that are helpful in a sexual sense, but for the most part, it's that community, it's that sensory stuff potentially, and then also community and
Just most of the
with other
community, I
humans.
think.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like fandom, I think that's like a big thing in it. Like even like the cosplay communities, right? Like there's a lot of people who are autistic who go to cosplay events or go to like anime events and things like that. There's just a lot of like dressing up in general, and that's like part of the special interests. And I think that that kind of rolls into like sometimes furries or BDSM or like the pups. Like these things can become special interests. And like it's kind of like that like special interest for a different part of your life, right? Like you can have like a career special interest, you can have your hobby special interest, and you can have a sexual interest that's special. And like there's a lot to delve into more than just like I like vaginas or I like penises.
Well, and I don't think that that means that everybody needs to have this, like, hey, this is my thing in terms of sexual kink and all of that. I think it's more so just this whole entire conversation. What it does is it unravels kind of some of those maybe thoughts that neurodivergent humans have had about this stuff, opens up the realm of possibilities so that whatever that is for you, even if it's not anything that's outside of already what you're doing within your home with your partner, right, and feels very vanilla or whatever, it still gives you more language and more things to consider as you experience any type of intimacy, really, you know?
Yeah, yeah. There was one study I looked at that talked a little bit about how autistic individuals are more likely to have like, what is it, like special objects that they are interested in, or more likely to have like a paraphilia. Is that like a paraphilia, right? Or like that. Not necessarily like obsessive about it to the point of DSM paraphilia, of like, I have a disorder. That's more of like a psychopath. We could do another episode of that, and I have a lot to talk about on that. Oh my God, I would love that. But just more so if it's like I think autistic people are just more likely to feel like objects have emotions sometimes. We're more likely to feel empathy for like stuffed bears or like, oh my God, that stuffed animal got left behind. And I think sometimes that can translate into a sexual thing. So that could be part of like a more likely than like a neurotypical person to have a fetish. I almost want to go rewatch that show on TLC. Did you ever watch it where like there's a guy having sex with a car?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, for
That
sure.
one.
My Strange Addiction, or wait,
Yeah, it
is
was
that
like
what it
something
is?
like that. It was something like that. It wasn't My Strange Addiction, but it was something like that, and it had to do My Strange Sex maybe, but it was like a lot of people having sex with objects.
Well, and there's also like people who like to pretend that they're babies and things like that, right?
Well, there are people who like to pretend to be babies, and that is the thing. And like there are also like a lot of like restrictions in society for autistic people that like this is childish. You cannot be into this, or like this would be considered pedophilia if you do that. And I think like in a lot of these kink communities, it like opens the door where people can explore things that are stereotypically like childish in a safe place. So that's kind of like a cool thing about like looking at this. There are like studies that looked at like a lot of like the different things. So we looked at like power exchange was one, like role play. So that was another one. Voyeurism, like having like a mask on and like showing your parts off to people, or like watching people, cucking, right? Like object fetish, paraphilia, like being into a specific body part. There's a lot of like sensory things. So when it comes to like some of like the sensory things that a neurodivergent person might enjoy more, it could be like wax, it could be ice, it could be like blindfolding, or like being deprived of sound, like if that's something that like overstimulates you on the daily. It could be like the deep pressure of having ropes on. It could be like spanking or flogging, or like any like stingy impact kind of things that like bring a little bit extra of that input. It depends on like what they're looking for in their nervous system for regulation, hypersensitive, hyposensitive. Like there's so many different parts of that that we're going to explore next week on our episode. But that is something that is another huge component of this too. So I just kind of want to end on a couple of the quotes from some of the qualitative studies that we've read that I thought were really important, just to kind of give some perspective on like why people find such connection in these communities, and why they find such like internal pleasure and might be more likely to enjoy sex if they are a part of these. So my brain is constantly running on 6 threads. Outside of kink or sleep, I don't get to shut it off. So allowing someone else to have that power over you so you don't have to think and don't have to be masking that entire time, huge thing. Whatever happens was going to be enjoyable because it was from a pre-agreed menu of possibilities. That's where we were talking about that. Scripting was not always about following the exact same pattern, but about knowing what was possible. So looking at like consent as structure, looking at like what is going to happen, and I know it's predictable. And then also looking at like the component of trauma processing through communities. Like if you have rape trauma and you want to be interested in BDSM, like having consent in advance and having like that aftercare component is huge. Like that could be game changing for someone who has trauma to like process and explore and like refine themselves and reconnect to their bodies. Because if you've ever been sexually assaulted, you will know that like sex is really fucking hard, and like there's a healing process that goes through that, and that could be years of therapy and years of like not wanting to be touched and all sorts of things. So that is a community that can offer some form of healing too for people who have trauma, because it is very trauma informed and trying to avoid inducing further trauma on people.
Yes, I feel like that's definitely the thing that we didn't touch on that I think is super important for sure, that I'm glad you brought it up, because there is a lot of like, right, it might be like, oh, that role switching is really important in these types of communities, right? But if that role switching is switching into something that is traumatizing to you, there has to be ways to either figure out, first of all, which of those things is going to be triggering. So that's going to be either, if you're a practitioner, referring somebody to therapy, trauma therapy, all of that, or if you're the person experiencing it, listening for your own stuff, figuring out what is it that is going to be triggering for me, and is there a lot of this in that community? And if it is a community that I'm like, there is a lot of it, but I still want to be a part of it, figuring out how, you can use the language within that community to ask for what you need, set boundaries, all of that. Because, for example, just in a regular day without any of the kink communities, like if somebody is role switching during sex to be, whatever they believe to see in porn, like they're gonna be maybe doing the same thing that they remember themselves doing in a sexual assault situation, right? And so there has to be that awareness so that you do feel safe in that community if it is something that is geared towards sex.
Yeah. So recommendations for mental health professionals, I would say like make sure that if you can take any like kink positive trainings and like educate yourself in the kink communities, especially the relationship between the kink communities and neurodivergence and around trauma. Really, really, really important, I think, for both med providers and also for therapists, like most importantly for therapists out of anybody. There are therapists who specialize in this and who are fucking amazing. You should probably just interview some at some point. I'm going to find somebody. And then as far as like, if you are just like listening and you are not a mental health professional and you're just a neurodivergent person who's kind of like exploring where you're at, like think about like if you have a history of trauma or if you don't, like what are the things that if I want to unmask would make me feel safe? Is it that like I would have like a script that I could follow? Is it that I would have like, the pressure to just like not the pressure to be verbal taken off of me? So maybe I could just not be verbal and just be tied up and be blindfolded and not have to like worry about what I look like, right? Like, is that better? But there's a lot of like different types of things you could explore when it comes to like sensory input and just like being perceived fears and all of that thing. Like there are so many ways to just enjoy sex if you are a person who just does not enjoy sex as a neurodivergent person.
Yeah, I think the sensory stuff is going to be super important and a big component of us coming up with, solutions to offer people has to do more so with that sensory side of it. I think this information though is good for people to have in case they aren't exposed to it. And that way they can start that path of educating themselves and becoming more aware of things as we also start to talk about some of the sensory stuff on our next episode.
For sure. So thanks for tuning in. Hit subscribe, hit like, leave a comment. Tell us about your experience. Tell us where we're wrong, right? Like we're speaking as autistic women who are still outsiders to these communities, kind of like looking at the evidence around them and kind of like trying to give insight on like the social part of it, right? But if you are in these communities and there's things you miss, like please leave us a comment so we can like educate ourselves, because we're here to learn too. So leave a review, leave us a 5-star on Apple Podcasts. That'd be cool. And tune in next week to learn more about sex and sensory. Thanks.